you tell me. I think
Yeah.
first.
So
Okay.
the MC will
Okay.
introduce you and
Okay. Okay. Fine. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, professors, students. Welcome to our special event this morning in Binus JWC Senayan, Jakarta. We have a special guest lecture today with the topic Europe towards 2030, Decline or Rebirth. Will be given by Mr. Nicolas Tenzer from Center for Study and Research for Political Decision, Serap, France. My name is Paramita Ningrum. I will be the moderator and including the MC for this event. So before we start, I would like to read the program for today. We will open with the opening remarks by Professor Tirta Mursitama, the Head of International Relations Study Program, Binus University, Jakarta, and also followed by another remarks by Mr. Antoine de Foucault du Poisson for IFI Jakarta. And then after that, we will have a guest lecture for about an hour and followed by question and answer session. After that, we have a token group photo and it is closed by lunch. Okay, without any further time, we will start the session with the first opening remark by Professor Tirta Mursitama.
Let me practice my French language that my wife taught me last night. Bonjour, Monsieur Nicolas Tanzer. Bonjour, Antoine de Foucault de Poisson, and all the Madame et Monsieur. Bienvenue à l'Université Binus Jakarta. C'est tout. Well, very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to Binus University International. On behalf of the university, I would like to welcome all of you, particularly Professor Nicolas Tanzer and Pak Antoine, Pak Quinty, and Ibu Ines, Mbak Anissa, also friends of my wife. And I realized that my life is surrounded by friends connection, actually, not at home but also in the university. I have a very close friend with Karen Imam, because we are also traveling a lot to many countries to pursue the vision of Binus University, Binus 2020, to be a world-class university, pursue the knowledge and innovation. So I represent the Vice Rector of Research and Technology Transfer here. Therefore, I would like to say welcome and thank you for coming, and also for the students and all partners. Then, I think this public lecture are very strategic and important, at least for two reasons. The first reason is that now the European studies, or the development of Europe, has been very dramatically changing. There are positive sides, but also on the other hand, and also there is maybe another the development on the different side. Therefore, we are here to listen from Professor can we call you Nicola?
Yes.
Yeah, Pak Nicola, to share his knowledge and ideas, because his CV is very impressive, and I think we are very happy to having him here in Binus University International to share his views on that. And the second thing, I think this is the continuation of the commitment of Binus University to have a close relations among the epistemic communities, professors, researchers, and as well as the support from the embassy, that we would like to be a close hub between the Indonesia and France, as well as ASEAN and European Union. Therefore, I hope that we can enjoy our discussion, and I encourage all the students or participants to ask more. And I believe as a academia here, there are many opportunities that we can learn from a prominent person like Pak Nicola here. And please make use of our acquaintance here and mention on your Twitter account or social media account, and just mention Binus University or Binus University International to share our wonderful occasion today. Even tomorrow we are expecting the long holiday. But once again, I thank to Pak Nicola and all friends here coming to Binus University, and let's enjoy the discussion. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Tirta, for your remarks. Now we start to listen to remarks from Pak Anton.
Selamat pagi semuanya. Nama saya Pak Antoine Dubuisson. Saya klasik kerjasama Universitas di Kedutaan Perancis, Institut Perancis. And I will switch right now in English because I already given all my bahasa Indonesia to you. So thank you for coming this morning to listen to the conference given by Pak Nicolas Tenzer. And first of all, thanks to Binus University to organize this event with the French Embassy and the French Institute. As I was saying to Pa Nicolas in the car this morning, going to Binus University, it's always a pleasure for us, for the French Institute in Indonesia, to work with Binus University. I humbly can say that Binus is one of our best partners in university cooperation, and as usual, the event organized this morning, well organized this morning, is a testimony of what I am saying. So thanks to Binus University again. And thanks to you to have joined us this morning in order to listen the conference of Pa Nicolas. It's an honor for us, for the embassy, for the French Institute to host such a personage as Mr. Tenzer is. He's one of the well-known specialists of international relations in France. Well-known specialist of cooperation, international cooperation. So, and of course, renowned specialist of Europe. So, thanks to Pa Nicolas, I'm pretty sure we will have a new pictures of what will be, what could be Europe in couple dozen of years. So. I will let the floor right now to let us the possibility to listen to Pa Nicolas. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Anton, for your remarks. Okay, now we start the lecture. So, please, Mr. Tenzer.
Thank you.
Or you would like to sit in the podium, would be fine too.
Thank you. Yes, of course. Thank you. No, ladies and gentlemen, so very distinguished audience, dear professors, dear Professor Musitama.
Excuse me, may I introduce your
sorry.
brief?
Sorry.
Probably the student would like to know.
Okay.
Okay, I would like to introduce Mr. Tenzer a little bit about him. He has a very long CV, but what I could see from his long CV, his major is history and politics, and also he has some interest on education, especially the young generation. And he also has an experience in the media and public service and think tank. So he has plenty of experience. So we hope that we can enjoy his very comprehensive lecture about the Europe towards 2030, decline or rebirth. That is very, very interesting topic. Decline and
Okay, so, okay.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to start again, and to thank you very much, and to thank you, and to thank all the people from the Binus University for welcoming here. And of course, the issue I will be talking about this morning is, I think, one of the most, I think, important, pivotal, because it's not about only Europe that we talk, but about the future of the world, and about the future of the very values that Europe is trying to promote, which are basically liberal values, values of open-mindedness, tolerance, openness, open societies. And of course, if I decided to name my conference, Europe towards 2030, decline or rebirth, it thinks that basically, I think the two possibilities are still open. Both decline and both rebirth. When it comes, of course, to the decline, I think that's basically because what we can see is that the very future of Europe is rather unpredictable. Because we are witnessing a lot of elements that I will point to them that could lead to a very, I would say, sharp and nasty pessimism. But I think that there are other elements that lead to optimism. Of course, as a European, and I was always a very strong advocate of Europe, and I think that we have, of course, to strengthen our strengths and to fight against our own weaknesses that I will, of course, recall. But in order to do that, I think we have also to understand what Europe. Of course, here you are in Asia, you are a member of Asian countries, and I think from this point of view, it's also interesting to make some comparison between Asian and of course, the EU, which are different natures, which are different kinds of organizations, but I think both can learn from the other. When it comes to the question of the pessimism, let me just point out, sorry, that's this way, okay, quite some elements that could lead to pessimism, and I will just try to comment most of them. First of all, I think it's really the lack of vision. The lack of vision. What's the long-term vision of the European leaders? Somehow it's quite difficult nowadays to really have this understanding. Of course, we have very recently, but I think it was the first time since about 15 or 17 years, you had two speeches of my own president and friend, Emmanuel Macron, who was talking about Europe, both in Athens and the Paris University, La Sorbonne, very recently, trying to figure out, first of all, what's the very values of Europe. And the values of Europe, that's basically freedom, that's liberty, that's the one I was just mentioning before, that's the question of tolerance. And when we are talking about also pessimism today, and of course we have to understand this, is because you have some of the EU countries who are not actually standing for those liberal values. See what happened in some countries you probably know a little bit about, like Poland, like Hungary, and maybe some others. You have a sort of illiberal moods invading them, with some nationalistic groups and sometimes some nationalist governments also in those countries trying to spreading out bigotry, which is basically intolerance, nationalistic values, and close-mindedness. And I think that we have, of course, when you are talking about the vision of Europe, it's also about basically a sort of liberal Europe that we are trying to understand. And quite often, I mean in the past, most of the European leaders were talking mostly about economic. And of course it's true that Europe is a very, I will say, very advanced and very successful, I think, economic areas with what we call the single market, integrated markets. It's also a zone in which we have a free, what we call the four liberties, or the four freedoms, which are the circulations, the free circulations of the, and free movement of the persons, of the goods, of the capitals, of the services. But we are not talking a lot about the values. And so it's very important that also my president and know some others are really committed to promote those values. But then we have, of course, to understand that Europe is also committed to define itself against its own enemies. And I think that's one of the most difficult things, because Europe still is very divided, I must say, between different positions when it comes to the relationship with the enemies and possible enemies, and especially I would say one of the enemy or adversary, I will speak very bluntly, I would say, is Russia. Because for the first time we have a country, and that's also part of the threat that we have to understand. You have Russia, just at the very center of Europe, invading another country, which is Ukraine, seizing part of its territory, which is Crimea, which belongs to Ukraine, and questioning and also upsetting the borders that were defined at the end of World War II or even before. So we have also to define, and this is one of the difficulties when it comes to the vision. It's a real question of what's real, how to define Europe against its enemies. Because when we are defining values, when we are defining Europe as a power, we have of course also to name and shame, in a way, name and shame those kind of enemies. But for most of the European leaders, it's also very difficult to do that. I can do as an intellectual and also an advisor to some of those people, but it's very difficult for the leaders to really to understand Europe against its enemy for very reasons that we have also to understand, which is that Europe defined itself as a continent of peace, and also as a continent that is committed to protect itself and to promote the peaceful settlement of conflicts. That's why also the EU and Europe at its very beginning was so also inspiring for the UN, and one was of the I will say the true founders of the UN, and also UN Declaration of Human Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was also a French guy who was very inspiring at the time, René Cassin. You may have heard about him, who was so inspiring from that. But that's also what is about Europe, and that's why also you was so inspiring, in the world. But now we have this problem of vision. We have also another problem with the question of leadership. Of course, I won't be here to make some advertisement for my own president. That wouldn't be correct. But of course, you have maybe Macron, who appears to be a potential, I would say, leader of the free world. Not only because of the values that he's promoting, but also because it seems to be the only one person nowadays in Europe who has a kind of international audience. Because you have, of course, the problem of Brexit, with the problem of UK, and it's very difficult for the UK to have strong leaders talking in the name of all the European countries, but also because you also have Trump in the US, obviously, but also you have some difficulties with Chancellor Merkel, because Mrs. Merkel was really labeled before as the true, I would say, queen of the free world. But now it's maybe more difficult. And so I think that's a sort of competition. But of course, I am talking about my own president, but maybe my own president cannot be accepted in all the 27 countries of Europe. And still you have a lot of divides, and divides which are potentially, I would say, very deadly for Europe. You have divide between the west and the east of Europe. You have the divide between the north and the north and the south. And some of those parts of Europe do not have exactly the same interests, do not have necessarily the same values. So you have some divides, and that's a true threat. Then you have, of course, a lot of things. We have, of course, the rise of the far-right groups, the rise of nationalist groups, the rise of Euroscepticism. But just to make a point about Euroscepticism, you have, of course, many parties, including some parties in France, the far-right parties, but also the radical left party, and now the new conservative party in France, who is very Eurosceptic. But still, if you are, when you're doing some, I will say, opinion reviews, opinion surveys in all the European countries, even in the country like the UK, you have most of the people, and especially the young people, but not only the young people, who are praising Europe very much. You don't have a sort of rejections of Europe of most of the people in no one single country in Europe, even in the countries who are you say, attacked by a sort of illiberal mood, as in Poland and Hungary, you have still a majority of people who are saying, well, we are basically Europeans. We are basically European. We don't want to reject. Sometimes you have some skepticism, some criticisms, but there is no rejection. Then you have, of course, other issues which can lead to a sort of pessimism, but also all those elements, pessimistic elements, are tempered by, I would say, a sort of counterpart, a more optimistic counterpart, which are, of course, the crisis of the eurozone, the question of the refugees crisis, and refugees crisis is very important because we have a sort of two kinds of difficulties. First of all, if we are not able to manage the refugees crisis, then, of course, first of all, it will be understood as a true failures of the European organizations. If you have a lot of refugees coming to Europe without this kind of management, then, of course, the natural consequence will be the rise of the far-right and nationalistic groups, which are true threats to Europe. But on the other way, if we are not able to address the question of the refugees crisis and to address, it means basically to welcome refugees, then the very values of Europe will be jeopardized. And I think if Europe is not standing for those kind of values and stand for the values of we have to welcome the people who are, of course, threatened in their own countries, who are escaping some countries which are countries in which you have war crimes committed by the government and by some allies of this government like Syria. If we are not able to stand with those people, to protect them, then Europe is no more Europe. And I think that's a true problem, and you know that you have a lot of divides within Europe about this question. So that's why I think the question of the refugees crisis is really deadly, and that's why also you had some countries, I think those of I am calling the enemies of Europe, like Russia, who are trying really also to create all the elements for this crisis to remain and remain and remain. And I think that's also something that we have to understand. Then you have other issues, and I will, of course, detail all of them, which is the question of the Brexit snowball effect. But still, I think Brexit is such an economic, social, and moral disaster that I think that no other country will exactly follow the British example. But still, you may have, because that's the question is of Brexit. I think it's something which is very interesting if we understand what it really means. It means that the question of rationality doesn't really matter, and the question of the patience that are spreading out into Europe are more important than the rationality. And if, of course, the British people were just able to favor this completely irrational mood, there is absolutely no reason for other countries not to follow the example. So I am a little bit, I will say, ambiguous about that, because I think that from one point of view, on the one hand, I think it's a very bad example. It's good that it's a bad example, but on the other hand, it's not because it's a completely bad example that it wouldn't work. I think that's something that we must have also in mind, which is the general question of, I think, irrationality. Of course, for Europe, it's a true challenge too, because basically Europe was a rational idea. Europe was pushed forward by rationalist thinkers like Kant, but like other authors that you may have, of course, even some poets like Victor Hugo, or you had also Paul Valéry and many others, or the Count from the Coudenhove-Kalergi, and you had a lot of people who were praising Europe. So it's something very rationalistic. But when you are stating that, of course, rationality for many people doesn't matter anymore, and we had the example with Brexit, when we had the idea that people could commit suicide, when there is no coherence, not only in Europe but also in the US, between the ideas that we are trying to promote our behaviors, I think then the very principle of Europe is really damaged. Just coming a little bit to the US, just to let you understand what I really have in mind. You know, I went one of those, there are some others, who were very unfortunately predicting Trump victory for many different reasons. One of the reasons was the one, when we're just trying to understand what happened in the US, you had a lot of people describing Mr. Trump, I mean during the election campaign, as someone who was, I will say, absolutely not trustable, who was unfit for presidency, who was absolutely has the very misogynic behaviors, who was a racist, etc., etc., but still voting for him. And so you had exactly the same issue in Europe. I think that many vote. That's also some things that appeared in European polls. You had many British people voting for Brexit, even if they were not certain that it would lead to a better economic situation and a better, I would say, situation for them personally. And I think that the question of irrationality is also something which is a threat to Europe, and not only to Europe, of course, to all, I think, of the countries around the world. But then you have, of course, a lot of other impacts which are very pessimistic, which lead to pessimism, which are the impact of terrorism. Of course, when you have terrorism, sometimes it creates, in the public opinion, a sort of tendency to close itself, and of course to try to name the people who are not, I will say, a fellow citizen, to name him or her as a real threat. And it creates basically a kind of xenophobia, and I think that's something that we have also to be aware of. Then you have, of course, the question of the US uncertainties, and I think from a geopolitical point of view, if we cannot rely on the US, and especially on the US guarantee, on the US deterrence, and especially, I would say, the legal umbrella, then I think it could be a real threat. And of course, that's the question of political Europe. We're a lot of talking about political Europe, and I just had just before a sort of interview here, and the people, I had a very, I would say, insightful questions, very interesting questions about, what could be the relationship between the EU and Indonesia, and of course you have an EU ambassador, but the problem is still the problem that Kissinger was naming very relevantly. I think it was in the 70s, which is what's the phone number of Europe. And of course you have Mr. Juncker, who is the president of the EU Commission. You have Mr. Tusk, who is the president of the European Council. You have Mrs. Mogherini, who is the High Representative for Foreign Policy. And of course you have the states of governments, or states, head of states, president, like Macron and some others. But I think, who is the real president? Who is the figure of Europe? And of course, Indonesia and other countries, not only Indonesia, could talk to Mr. Juncker, to Mr. Tusk, and to the prominent, I will say, the main head of states of government in Europe, like Mr. Macron or Mrs. Merkel and others. But still, you have a real problem of unity. And when we are just considering, if we consider the worst tragedy of our times, I think that's basically Syria. Of course, you have a lot of tragedy, and also in Asia, you have the tragedy of Myanmar, and I think that's, of course, something which is absolutely terrible, and that I'm just following day after day, and I think the slaughter and the genocide on the Rohingyas is something which is a true concern. But of course, if we consider Syria, in Syria you had just 500,000 people slaughtered by Assad government. You have ISIS, of course, but most of the people were slaughtered by Assad. And you had 12 million displaced people, half inside Syria, and the other part, 6 million also, outside Syria. And Europe, as such, was not able to address the issues. Nor was the UN, of course. And that's a true problem, which is, of course, has the EU still a voice? And I think that from this point of view, it also could be a true danger for Europe, if Europe is not able just to have a kind of unity. And the general factor, which is the weakening of all the European Union, all the, I would say, regional unions in the world, and I think that's also a danger. But then, I will, of course, to assess other elements, that could lead to, I will say, more optimistic forecast. One of the main factors I will insist on is that maybe what we are witnessing today is a kind of new realism. A new realism, because some people in the past were, I will say, thinking or advocating a kind of, I will say, United States of Europe idea, which is a sort of general federalistic union between all the members of the European Union. This idea, of course, is very generous. It could sound as a true ideal, but it's completely unrealistic. And I think that nowadays, with the device of Europe, because you have the threats to Europe, no one very seriously can say that the idea of the United States of Europe is a true idea. And so we are committed not to pursue a sort of kind of unrealistic ideas, but to, I will say, to work on things which are really possible. And from this point of view, that could sound a little bit paradoxical, I know, I think that could be a good idea. No, we are really committed to more realism. The second idea that I want to elaborate a little bit on is the idea of, which is the attractiveness of Europe. That's something maybe that we could have to discuss about. For many countries, Europe is a real attraction. I am traveling extensively to countries like Ukraine, like the Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, etc. Bosnia also. And for those countries, and I mean for especially, I would say, the liberals in those countries, just to be more precise, Europe is really something that we have for those people to enter in. We have to join Europe. We have to join Europe for many reasons, not only because of the Euro funds, not only because of, I would say, the money that they can get from Europe, but because of the ideas, because of the liberal ideas. And in their mind, it could not only bolster the reform in those countries, and being reform of the judiciary, to have regulations that comply with human rights, with rule of law, but also because in those countries they understand Europe as something which is an asset for the future. That's a true asset. That's an asset because then they will be more stabilized. And basically for many countries who are not still members of the EU or who still are, they have the choice between, I would say, the West, and basically the liberal West, and between the illiberal East, basically, I would say, Russia, or some other country, not only Russia, who are not liberal countries, who are not complying with the rule of law, who are not complying with the human rights standards, etc., with the civil rights. And that's the choice between the two areas. And I think that why Europe is very attractive, but also not only in this kind of regions, but I am talking sometimes traveling to Asia when some other people coming from other Asian countries, and they say, well, basically Europe is exactly what we want, and we also need the help of Europe. Europe could help ourselves to figure out what could be a sort of liberal country. An organization which is standing with liberal principle, with siding with these liberal ideas, with the idea of openness. And if we consider also all the development aid program that Europe was giving to many countries, African countries, some Asian countries, some Latin American countries, it was a true asset for those countries, and that was helping them to build something completely new, to re-engineer their processes, to develop themselves. And I think that we must not underestimate the role of Europe in creating the conditions for good governance and development all around the world. So that's why I think that Europe remains very attractive. And when I am talking with people in South Korea, in Japan, and of course in other Asian countries, they are all asking me, well, how do you succeed in creating this kind of Europe? And I think that from this point of view, I was talking about pessimism. We Europeans are more pessimistic about Europe than the others are. The others are considering really Europe as a success. But sometimes when I'm talking with my own farmer, you know, because I have some countryside house and with a farmer and some cows and this sort of thing. And my farmer, I remember when in the referendum in 2005, told me, well, we farmer, we never receive anything from Europe. And I said, well, just stupid guy, completely wrong. And for the European farmers, if Europe weren't there, they will all have died. And even for the farmers in Europe, Europe was the very condition for them just to stay alive. They receive a lot of things, but they have absolutely no recognition, no understanding of what Europe brought to them. And from outside, I think you have a different understanding. You understand what Europe is all about. And of course, that's why I'm saying that Europe countries basically have the same values. Europe is also very central in the European games. When we are considering all the threats coming from outside, especially, I would say, terrorism, you see that the links between European countries and African countries, between the links of Europe and the Middle East countries in general, that's something which are very important. And I know when I'm discussing sometimes with some people also in Asia, they say, well, we also need to balance the Chinese influence, the US influence, the Indian influence with European influence. Because we know that, of course, European companies want to do business. European countries, of course, they have some values to promote. They have, of course, some economic interest to promote. But they are less, I will say, invasive sometimes than the Russian interest, Chinese interest, and Russian interest. And I think that from this point of view, I think that Europe, if it got more united, it's getting more united, I think could be a true also values, also to be a sort of counterbalance, a counter-equilibrium, bring us another equilibrium also in other parts of the world. That's why also Europe is so important. And then I was talking a lot about Russia, because I think that basically I could elaborate on, of course, if there are some questions about it. I think that Russia is basically a systemic threat, the more important threats that we are witnessing now. Of course, maybe for you it could be not that, I would say, visible. But for me, I think it's really visible, because it's not about the threat to Ukraine, it's not about the threat to Syria, but it's a global threat, because also it's a threat to the liberal values, the threat to the international principle, the threat to, with a lot of vetoes in the UN Security Council, the threats to the international organizations. But I think that Russia's threat was a sort of wake-up call. And I think that no people, because they have this threat, can understand better than they used to do before what they are really standing for. And also, that's the same in a way, I'm not talking about US threat, of course, because basically the US is, of course, our more important allies, even with Trump. But But we are witnessing US uncertainties. And I think that's also a true incentive for Europe to take control of its own destiny. And especially when it comes to the security policy, defense policy, if of course the deterrence of the US is not that trustable, then of course we have, of course, to build something by our own. You remember the very the ambiguousness of President Trump towards NATO. At the beginning, he said, "Well, NATO is not something which is not an up-to-date organization, and I am not really committed to use, if needed, the Article 5 of NATO treaty, which is the mutual guarantee." And then after he said, "Well, NATO is more important, etc." So, but basically, you have these uncertainties. And because of that, it means that Europe, and that I think the understanding of our own president, and of course also of Chancellor Merkel, we have to promote our own defense and security organizations. And why? That's why we very recently decided to upgrade our own defense and security policy. And of course, there is another thing which is quite important, which is the wake-up call after Brexit. But also because of what happened, with the threats to liberal values in Poland and Hungary. What we are witnessing right now is a sort of wake-up call, but also the waking up of the civil society in Europe. The civil society in Europe understand better than they used to understand better the real threats. And you have a lot of civil societies organizations. See all the people, for instance, what we call Pulse of Europe. I don't know if you know this organization, which is basically a civil society organization. And you had a lot of demonstrations all across Europe of the people coming from the sea, and especially young people, promoting and defending the liberal values. You have a lot of people also in Poland, in Hungary, taking to the street with a lot of placards saying, well, we need Europe. We are praising Europe. We need liberal values of Europe. So you have the civil society organizations, and I think the civil society organization is also something which is very, very important. No, I think that we have maybe to understand what also Europe is all about. And after that, I will give you some scenarios about Europe, not to be too long, and to open, of course, the floor to the discussions. First of all, what's very difficult, not only for the Europeans, but also for other countries around the world to understand when it comes to Europe, is that Europe could be very paradoxical, what I call, I think, basically as non-linear organizations. First of all, we have to understand Europe as a political construction, but without a true political unity. I was just mentioning before that the dream of the United States of Europe is completely over. But you still have a political dimension of Europe, a geopolitical dimension of Europe. And what I was saying is that political Europe doesn't imply federalism. So that's something that we have to understand. We have to understand, and for those of you who were, of course, learning or doing political theory or political philosophy, I think it's quite important. We have to understand politics without sort of United States. We have to understand that the reality of political Europe doesn't imply political unity. But that could be a lesson for Asian too. And I think that's something we have to think about. We have to think something about the new kind of organizations that we still do not have in the classical theoretical books about the political organizations. Then you have to understand also two contradictory, at a certain point, ideas that have governed Europe. and that used to be considered as completely opposite. The first idea of Europe was the idea which was inspired by the German philosopher that you know, Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, 18th century, late 18th century philosophy, he died in 1804, you see, and he wrote a lot, and especially what he called a treatise on perpetual peace. And and of course, his idea was very inspiring for Europe, because what he said is that Europe is all about universal values. Europe is about the rule of law. Europe is about the idea of universal law. And of course, from this point of view, Europe could extend indefinitely as far as the other countries are complying with the very principles of rule of law. And the Kantian idea was the rule of law, of course, is also the equivalent in the political realm of the idea of morality in, of course, in moral philosophy. And of course, these ideas were very inspiring. And that's why, of course, I was mentioning the human rights, I was inspiring the idea of the peaceful settlement of all international disputes and this kind of things. Everything was inspired by Kant. But of course, you had the other idea. The other idea was promoted by some politicians, was the idea of Europe as a power, as a great power or middle power, I don't know, but as a power like the US, like China, like Russia, like France, like the UK, etc. And of course, what does power means? Power, it means that you must have, of course, borders. So you have to decide what must be the borders of Europe. Because in the other Kantian idea, you don't have borders. Second thing, with the power, even more difficult for Europe, is you have to define enemies, or at least adversaries. And you must be prepared to fight. It's not about peace. It's then about war. It's about defense. It's about protection. And the problem nowadays is that, in fact, many of the people, even some people I know, even some people who are good friends, like Jacques Delors, like Pascal Lamy and other French people, but you have also Italian people like Romano Prodi and others, who are thinking, well, we have to unite Europe. Europe is all about the economy, and I recently had a discussion with Pascal Lamy, especially, and we are good friends, but sometimes we disagree. I was saying, well, geopolitics don't matter. The question of diplomacy is not important. What's important is the economic unity. And I said, no, Pascal, no, you are wrong. Basically, it's about patience, it's about power, it's about fight. And basically, the problem is that the leaders now must have a geopolitical understanding of Europe. Because the German house is burning. Because we have the enemy just 2,000 kilometers from us. I know we have to reconcile those two ideas. Values, human rights, yes. We have to stand to those values, but we must be also prepared to war or conflict. And we have to define borders, yes. We have to define borders. And for me, and that also maybe the fourth idea, there is still the idea of enlargement or deepening. Those ideas were also considered as opposite. We have to deepen Europe, to move forward into more integration, especially economic integration, social integration, etc. But we have also to enlarge Europe. And up to what point must we enlarge Europe? I was already mentioning the Balkan states, and I think the idea, but very clear on that, the idea of enlargement of Europe is not very popular among the public opinion of European countries. Certainly not. But we have to enlarge Europe, certainly to Balkan states, but then you have two conflicting, I will say states, two countries with whom with which the European people are not very comfortable. First example is Turkey. And the problem is that since 1963, we opened the possibility of Turkey to enter Europe. And these principles have been completely reaffirmed in the Copenhagen summit in 1996. And of course, no, people say, well, no, Turkey, no, it's not possible. And of course, the problem is that very concretely nowadays, because of course the crackdown on human rights, civil liberties, of course we cannot accept that Turkey join Europe. Right now, that's just not impossible with Mr. Erdogan, and probably it was not also possible before with the, I would say, the importance of the military influence, you know, in the public sphere. But then you have a difference between the question of the government and the question of principles. And I remember I made a report which was not public in 1995 for the government. I was traveling to Turkey. I met with a lot of officials and people there. And the people in Turkey told me, well, just help us to look westwards and not eastwards. And some of the people who were really liberal in Turkey saying, well, Europe could help us to fight against all evils. And that's also a true problem. Then you have, and of course nowadays the problem is probably settled, and even my president, Emmanuel Macron, said, well, okay, probably the opening to Turkey, well, not of course something which is for tomorrow, or not after tomorrow, certainly, but still, you have the question. But no, you have another question, which is the question of Ukraine. And I'm traveling extensively to Ukraine. It's a very, very, very long time. I know, I think Ukraine quite well, and many of the people there. You had a lot of issues, like corruption issues. That's a true disaster. You had a lot of mafias. But the people of the civil society, not talking about the government, in Maidan, they revolt. There was this kind of uprising at the very name of European values, for freedom, for liberty. And so could we say to Ukraine, because of course Russia opposes, that you are not member of Europe, potential member, of course, if you are fulfilling all the requirements, complying with all the requirements of the acquis, what you call, etc., etc. Of course, there are a lot of conditions, and I think Ukraine is not likely to enter Europe because of the independence of the judiciary, which is not completely, I will say, guaranteed, etc., etc. Of course. But still, I think the question of the principle. And then, of course, we have to understand that enlargement is very vital, because we cannot say to a country who comply with the EU regulations that it cannot enter Europe. And of course, it's also helping those countries to side with us, to side with liberal values, to side with what we used to call before the free world. And also that's a very incentive for those countries to join us. And then we have, of course, to understand also another problem. In a very recent week also, my president, Emmanuel Macron, was talking about that. With the traditional opposition of one single Europe and multi-speed Europe. Some people say, well, Europe is Europe. Europe means Europe. You have some common principles, some common rules. You choose everything or nothing. But no, most of the people say, well, just look. It's just impossible to be not to understand that with 28 countries, and tomorrow it could be not 27 after Brexit, but also 31, 32, that everything could be exactly doing the same, belonging to the same kind of unions, going with the same speed to the main objectives, you have maybe to understand something different. And already you have a lot of differences. You know, we have a single currency, which is the euro, but only for 19 countries and 28. And all the countries are belonging to the eurozone. We have the Schengen Area, which is very important. Schengen Area, as you know probably, it's a sort of free zone. And when I am traveling to the Baltic states, when I'm traveling, of course, to Poland, when I'm traveling to Germany, to etc., I just do not have to show my ID. And quite often, because I just have a very small luggage, I go through the control at Paris, just controlling, of course, if I don't have a bomb in my luggage, okay? I don't show my ID, just my ticket. I enter the plane, I don't show my ID, and when I arrive in Vilnius or in Warsaw, etc., I don't show my ID. There is absolutely no ID control, which is absolutely wonderful. But of course, still, not all European countries belong to the Schengen area. And you have, of course, some countries outside, like Switzerland and Norway, who are not a member of the EU, who belong to the Schengen area. Of course, that could be the same for defense. That could be the same. But the problem is that the common plate, there must be a common plate. And I think a robust common plate for everyone. Of course, you may choose soft drinks, maybe, and you have a choice between the different soft drinks or the entrances, but there must be a common plate. And I think that also you have to make societies. And then, of course, you have also to understand that you have to understand that you have the EU organizations, but you have also other organizations which are really matter, and especially one, which is NATO. Of course, you have countries who are not members of the EU, like, of course, notably the US and Canada, who are members of NATO, but still, NATO is basically a European organization. Because one of the main aims of NATO was, and still is, to protect Europe. And then you have to think about what could be the next relationship between the NATO and the EU. And you have another organization, which is OSCE, which was built between some of the former Soviet countries, who were Soviet countries at the time of the CSCE, which was the ancestor of the OSCE, and the European countries, and the US and Canada, which has also an organization which aims was to protect, to defend, of course, the cooperations between the European countries in the whole Europe and the big Europe. And you have to think about this kind, I think, of the organizations. So that's, I think, all the challenges that we really have that we have to do. So just a sort of conclusion. I don't have the time to go into all the different scenarios. I think we have to understand maybe what the main guidelines for the future of Europe. And I will try to be very short on that. First of all, I think that there's a question of peace. And the question is, not only for Europe as such, but for Europe in the world, how it could be a factor that guarantee the peace and offer fair conditions for peace settlements in some areas of the world who are suffering war. Especially, I mean, the Middle East, but it could be the Africa, and could be maybe Asia, why not? And I think if Europe could be a sort of honest and trustable broker for peace settlement, I think basically it could be a good thing. And sometimes it could be a kind of new legitimacy for Europe, if it could move towards these directions. Then there is a question of values. And I think that's the only chance for Europe to be recognized in the world is to be a values-oriented zone, but also a zone who doesn't turn a blind eye a blind eye when the values of human rights are violated around the world. Europe, as such, I think, must speak loud and clear when you have a crackdown on basic values. It's maybe more easy for Europe than for some states, like I would say the US or even France or Germany, etc. But I think that Europe, that's really something that's very important for Europe. Because if Europe remains silent, then I think there will be absolutely no legitimacy for Europe. And that's true, of course, in the Middle East. That's true in Europe, because, as I was mentioning at the beginning, you have some European countries who are not completely fulfilling, I will say, the basic requirement of Europe when it comes to the values. But it could be true for some Asian countries too. That's basically the legacy of Europe. If we forget those values, this legacy, there will be absolutely no legitimacy of Europe, I think, in the future. Then I think it's a question of democracy. I had a question just before in the interview about the value of the higher education for Europe. And I said, well, basically, what's about the higher education? That's about humanities. That's about open-mindedness. That's about tolerance. That's about fight against bigotry. That's about respect. And I think that from this point of view, you have still a lot of problems in Europe. When I see that in my own country, because I'm not here just to say that everything is remarkable in my own country. When you think that a lot of young voters were voting for the far-right party, basically, which is all about hatred, about nationalism, etc. I say there is a true problem. When I see that in some other country, you have the young voters just turning to nationalist groups, that's a true problem. And that's one of the problems, I think, that Europe must address. And I think that's the questions which is very, I will say, pivotal for Europe's future, is the question of the civil society and the question of the youth, and the question of the ideas that the youth have, that it could just discuss with other cultures, other civilizations, and keep Europe open to the world. And maybe that's also the condition for the world to be open to Europe. Then I think that one of the other questions, which is very important, is the questions of the autonomy of Europe. And that's a problem that, of course, which is to links to the question of the transatlantic links. First of all, I have to remind us that the transatlantic links are absolutely vital for Europe. If we don't have a good relationship with the US, if there is no confidence between Europe and the US, then I think Europe will become very dysfunctional. That's one of the reasons I completely agree with my own president, Emmanuel Macron, and say, well, we know who Trump is. I'm certainly not very comfortable with Mr. Trump, and probably Emmanuel Macron is not very comfortable with Mr. Trump either. But we have must have good relationship with the US. Of course, we have to say the truth to Europe, and we have to oppose the US. For instance, when the US decide to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, is not complying with some social regulations, threatening environment, and of course we have a lot of disagreements with the US, and especially also on trade issues, etc. But if there is no good links with the US, nothing can work. So we have to show the differences, we have to talk frankly with the US, but the US is an ally. But at the same time, we have to show that Europe is capable of autonomy. And that I think one of the true challenges for the years or decades to come is that Europe has to show that it is completely autonomous also from the US. Not aligning with the US, not siding with the US, being basic allies, of course, to the US, but being able also to take its own decision. Sorry, I will come back to Syria. But we can also give the example of Mali and Niger and the Sahel areas in which France is a lot of, and France soldiers, troops are engaged in. But when I come to Syria, for instance, if the US doesn't want to take action, if because of the Russian and sometimes Chinese vetoes, the UN Security Council is completely paralyzed, then I think Europe has to take action. And that's one of the true debate when it comes to the legitimacy of Europe for the future. Will Europe be able to take action just to protect not only its own interest, but the interest of freedom in the world? I think that's one of the key issues that we must have. And then there is another question, and I will maybe just end with that, which is the question of the citizenship. And that's something also that you have to think, maybe in Asia too. Certainly you have, more than us, I think a sense of, I will say, citizenship, which is the citizenship in your own country. You are basically Indonesian, or Chinese, or Malay, or, but sometimes, for instance, if you are Malay, you are also basically Chinese, a Chinese Malay, or I don't know, that's maybe some things which is a question that I had to discuss with a lot of people here in the regions, or Singaporean, or I don't know, etc. In Europe, we have up to a certain point the same idea. We are French, German, etc. But we are also European. I think there is still a sense of European community. And the question is, how could we have, in the same time, 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes, different senses of belonging? We are French citizens. I am born in Paris, or I was born in Paris, I'm Parisian, or I was born in, I don't know, in the Netherlands, or I was born, I don't know, in Barcelona, which is Spain and Catalonia. Both, that's a question. But I am basically European. And I think one of the main questions that we have to address is how can we have different sense of belonging which are not too much conflicting. And that's the European sense of belonging must be not, I will say, prevail over the others, but still be as important as the others. And I think that's something that we will have certainly to address, to work on, and especially with the young people of Europe, who may have these different senses of belonging at the same time. I think that's another challenge that really we have to address. So my last word is when we see that what could happen in 2030 or 2035, you see you may have different kinds of scenarios. You may have a black scenario with more Russia's threat, with economic difficulties, economic collapse, with the rise of the far right, with the rise of nationalism. We may have a blue scenario with, of course, committed leaders, with a lot of the civil society promoting Europe, with peace, with the reinforcements of the EU institutions, with very important European leaders and national countries, leaders too. And we may have also a sort of Greece scenario in between. Still Europe going on, but maybe like business as usual. And so might the question, which is a soft question for me, if we don't have the blue scenario, but not also the black, which is unlikely, fortunately, but a sort of grey scenario which is rather mediocre. And what will be the influence in the world in the years to come? And I think that's why we Europeans, we have really committed to make Europe a success. Europe is still a success. but I think it must be a greater success again. And I think that the slogan "Make Europe Great Again," I think that's not about, I will say, power against. It's not about dominations, but it's basically about cooperations. And it's about openness, and as I said, basically liberal values. Thank you very much for your attention.